The beauty of law that most people don't understand is it's not big law libraries and complex volumes of legislation. That's what we've perverted law into being. And of course, there's going to be legislation, there's going to be rules here and there. That's the nature of a community and of government. But those are only lawful if they abide within the parameters of law itself. People will message me and they'll email me all the time and they'll say, well, how do I know this law? Where do I find this law? How do you understand law? And there's something that they often miss that I do mention, but perhaps not so concisely as we're going to talk about today, and that's the nature of law. Now, I will stop and I'll look up a piece of legislation. I might say, well, this is a law on unmarked cars and government needs to follow it. It's not just about unmarked cars, it's about liberty. It's about justice, and it's about a government that respects the people they serve. That's what government is supposed to do. But let's think a little more about what happens with that law. Why is that principle so important? Why do I go out and talk to police officers and start big conversations about it? And why does it matter? First, yes, I looked up the legislation, but I don't know all this legislation. I don't sit for hours and hours at a time every day and study the latest legislation, federal and local and state and all this stuff. And sometimes people think I do. They'll send me messages and they'll say, well, what's the legislation on unmarked cars in my state? And I say, well, you need to go look. But it goes beyond this, because if you understand the nature of law, you understand that a disrespect for the public is lawless in and of itself. And now we come back to the real nature of law. And one of the reasons that I understand law and I understand these situations, it's not always because I know every piece of legislation. Even the government officials most of the time have no clue what legislation says unless they go look it up, because there's so much of it, it's ridiculous. It's the same with federal legislation. There's so much legislation and so many new rules being made from all these agencies that actually have no constitutional or legal authority to make rules. That's supposed to be left only to elected legislatures. That they don't even know all the rules and laws that are being made. They're just piling up and piling up and piling up. So basically everything is becoming a crime, and government can accuse you anytime they want. But we come back to the nature of law. And if you really want to understand the nature of law in terms of America's founding and before, go back to political philosophers like John Locke, on whom the principles of our United States Constitution and our government were founded. Go back to natural law, to God's law, to the fundamentals of right and wrong. But on a civil sense, look at people like Frederick Bastiat, like John Locke, who laid out the civil principles of this is law. This is natural law. This is God-given rights. These are the fundamental principles. And the fundamental principle of law is this. Law exists to protect your life, your liberty, and your property. Anything that does not do that, anything that does not protect the individual's, not just yours, but everyone's life, liberty, and property is not law, it is lawless. Here's the fundamental disconnect that people are not realizing. Law is not necessarily legislation. We have legislators making law all the time. We saw this in Oregon with SB 941. We saw this in Washington when the people were duped into passing I-594 to restrict guns. And people say, well, this is law, you have to obey it. Some people will say, well, I'm a Christian, I believe I should obey the law. Some people just say, well, we should obey the law because government says. That's not what any of this comes down to. You see, we should all obey the law. We should all obey the law that is natural and fundamental. And that is that justice, due process, and ultimately law existing to protect your life, your liberty, and your property. So you can have legislation within those boundaries. On a state level, you can have legislation that's within the state constitution, as long as it doesn't violate the federal constitution. And on a local level, you can make laws in your county as long as they don't violate the constitutions, as long as they don't violate people's rights. You see, the whole point of why we set up our government and our republic the way we did, why we set up the laws the way we did, was to preserve the nature of law. And that is to protect everyone's life, liberty, and property. So your rights ends where your neighbor's begins. You can't say, well, to protect my life, I need to steal my neighbor's food, because now you're violating their life, liberty, or property. The fundamentals of law are simple, and when you get down to these simple things, everything starts to get a little clearer. If you look at any piece of legislation in the light of the Constitution, and zooming out even more, the principles of law, life, liberty, and property, then you can quickly look at that legislation and say, well, this is lawful or this is not. A piece of legislation that says your neighbor has to mow their lawn or they go to jail is not law. It's criminal and it's lawlessness. And any government official that supports or enforces it is lawless. Now, you could have a group of homes, let's say, in your community, and you enter into a contract as a community to say, those of us who buy houses on this block are going to mow our lawn once a week. And if you choose to live in that neighborhood, then you've made that agreement. And now they could, maybe fine you civilly or sue you if they wanted to because you made a legally binding contract to that end. That's one of the reasons I don't want to live in a neighborhood that tells me how I manage my own property. Okay? So somebody's going to say to me, well, that's tyranny because they're telling you what to do. No, you made a contract with them not to give up someone else's rights, but to abide by a set of rules on a civil sense within your community. Government has no authority whatsoever to make rules like that in regards to people's private property. So contrast this. If the government makes a law and they say everybody in town has to mow their lawn once a week or they will be fined and go to jail, now the government is lawless because government only has the ability to protect life, liberty, and property and to ensure that law and order is kept. They serve us. So a government official who's swearing an oath to uphold the Constitution, to uphold life, liberty, and property, is saying, I will preserve law. Not law as in whatever legislation we decided to pass this week, but law as in real law. And so this is what you need to understand. By all means, go out. Look up the legislation. Pay attention to what your legislators are doing. If they pass something ridiculous like a gun restriction, defy it, oppose it, rally the people together in your community and say, no, we will not comply with this because it is not law, it is lawless. But understand the nature of law, because when you understand the nature of law, all of this gets simple. So when I go out and I'm talking to people and I'm dealing with public officials and I'm challenging them on law or justice, I may go and look up the legislation. But what's more important is that I understand what law is. Now, a great place to start on this that's not a real long read is John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, because he lays down the principles of really how the American Republic was set up in terms of a government by the consent of the governed, but he also lays down principles of law, of self-defense, and it really is sensible stuff. Another one you can look at is Frederick Bastiat's The Law, and that's a great read as well. That's also very short, and it gives the fundamental principles of law. These things go outside constitutions or legislation or any of that. And as much as I love the Constitution, you can zoom out and see an even bigger picture by understanding what law is. And when you understand what law is, why the Constitution was written the way it was written starts to make sense. And all the excuses and the cop-outs of those who say, well, this doesn't apply and that doesn't apply, and we can twist and we can bend and we can make the law that we want because we were elected, it all becomes foolishness because you realize that every single one of these legislators who's out making law that violates people's individual liberties and rights and property, they're not acting as legislators. At the moment they do that, they cease to be lawmakers. They simply become criminals. And we should regard these criminals, these bureaucratic terrorists who make law that hurts and destroys people's property, that extorts money from them, that abuses them outside the principles of law, that tells them you have to do this and this and this with your property or we're going to take it from you. You have to pay taxes to us for the property you own or we are going to take it from you and sell it. Folks, this is not law. And if we start understanding what law truly is, then we can look at our government and say, who do you think you are? You will be held accountable because you are a criminal and we do not tolerate bureaucratic terrorism from our government officials. And that's what we need to start doing, America. That's how we need to start standing on principle, on law, and on liberty, and take America back.